reading out of Exodus 13, the first section 13, 17 through 18, and then later in chapter 14. When Pharaoh let the people go, God did not lead them on the road through the Philistine country, though that was shorter. For God said, if they face war, they may change their minds and return to Egypt. So God led the people around by the desert road toward the Red Sea, and the Israelites went up out of Egypt ready for battle. Moses took the bones of Joseph with him because Joseph had made them, the Israelites, swear an oath, and he had said, God will surely come to your aid, and then you must carry my bones up with you from this place. Chapter 14, 21 through 22. Then Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and all that night the Lord drove the sea back with a strong east wind and turned it into dry land. The waters were divided, and the Israelites went through the sea on dry ground with a wall of water on their right and on their left. This is the word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God. In 1956, with a budget of $13 million, which back then, and honestly now, is a lot, the movie, The 10 Commandments, was the most expensive and yet most financially successful movies at the box office at the time. Some of you remember this, yeah? Anyone else forced to watch this at a young age? Yeah, it's trauma we're still healing from, yeah? Now, if you didn't know, this movie was critically acclaimed. It had 7 Oscar nominations as well as 1 giant win at the Academy Awards. And for some of you, that is ancient and archaic news. You're like, 1956? What? Did they even have TVs then? I think barely, but that's not the point. The point is that this ancient story of Moses, Israel's Exodus, and the 10 Commandments was a story that people wanted to hear, that people enjoyed, like really enjoyed. And it didn't stop with our grandparents' generation, because in 1998, a second movie was released about Moses and his journey with the Israelites. Does anyone know what that movie was? Yeah, it's getting weird in here. It is the infamous Prince of Egypt, which I feel like is important to confess to you. I saw it for the first time yesterday. I know, I feel very ashamed, and I feel a lot of shade. I knew that was coming. Now, this movie, if you can't tell, was wildly successful in and of itself. It was financially very successful. It had a star-studded cast, yeah? Shocking. I was in the movie, like, I'm the person who's like, and who is that? And looking it up. Unbelievable. And even to this day, it has a cult following because we can tell you're in the room, which we're glad you're here. My best friend is why I watched the movie, because she's part of the cult. This story of Moses and the Israelites, the story we've been sitting in all summer, is one that the world has undoubtedly been captivated by. So much so that even Hollywood has thrown money and time and energy into telling it and selling it, which at a few levels tells us that there is something in the human soul that not only resonates but seemingly cheers and even hungers for a great story like this about deliverance. It seems that in the human condition, there's a desire to know rescue. And not only for ourselves, but for others as well, to know a rescue that actually changes our reality. This great deliverance story is a story we love to hear. But more than that, I think it's a story we all long to experience. Like I mentioned, we've been in the book of Exodus this summer, and we're working through it kind of line by line, story by story. And this is, if you've been following along, a bit of a heavy lift. There is a lot to say about Yahweh, the God of the Israelites, and a lot to say and learn from the people of Israel themselves. Now, last week you'll remember that we had Josh White here from Door of Hope, and he shared with us and reminded us that this whole story points to Jesus. That the imagery and language we see woven into the Exodus story finds its culmination in the work of Jesus on the cross. Now, hopefully, you've also had a chance to listen to the other podcast that we released last week. How many of you have done that? With Tim Mackey and Tyler? Okay, so a lot of you should feel some shame right now and be motivated sometime this week to listen to it. But this was all about Passover, which is where we last left off in our story. And Passover, as we hear, you will hear, Lord willing, in the podcast, was this moment for the Israelite people where they not only experienced God's power, but also his protection. Passover was and is a critical part in God's deliverance to the people of Israel. And it is the beginning of where our story picks up today. So with that, we're going to look at this famous story together. Are you ready? Yeah, okay. Well, Gerald and Christian are, and that feels very encouraging to me as a teammate. We're going to look at this story through 3 movements today. So if you're a note taker, this is for you. We're going to frame it through significant shifts, looking back, and promise over peace. Okay, let's get started. Now, here's what I'm going to do. I'm not going to make us read 2.5 chapters of the Bible this morning. Are you glad? Welcome to church. In fact, I'm not even going to take this text line by line because I just felt like the Spirit was up to something different. So what I'm going to do is review the story with you this morning kind of through a storytelling lens. And then from there, I'm going to try to draw your attention to some significant symbols, some significant moments in this story that I think are going to shape where the Spirit's leading us this morning. So if you're a bit of a Bible nerd, you'll want to get your Bible out for this part. You can turn to Exodus 13 and we'll kind of start there. I'll give you cues when we're moving on. If you're like, no, man, it was a long, hot day yesterday and I'm just chilling, good for you. Just rest up and we'll go the storytelling route together. Sound good? All right, Exodus 13, starting in verse 17. Now, this story, like I said, picks up on the heels of Passover. And what's just taken place is actually super wild. Pharaoh, this great oppressor, has let the Israelite people go. And go meant that he's allowed them to leave Egypt, where he has enslaved them their whole lives, in pursuit of a different life altogether. And you'll remember that he does this quite reluctantly and in the wake of many deaths of Egyptian children, including his own firstborn son. In verse 17, we're told that Pharaoh let the people go, and we're told that God also led the people. And he did so, as we read, graciously, because we know that God led them, at least from our text, on a road that would ultimately have them avoid a battle or a war with this people group called the Philistines, which you'll hear about later in the scriptures. Now, the author of this book does a funny thing, and he calls out what's happening. And in so many words, he says, hey, they're going the long way. The path that Yahweh has them on would not be the most direct route, but a route that would ultimately keep them from destruction and from changing their mind about God and where he was taking them. And this is something we could bypass pretty quickly if we wanted to, but this is actually not a small thing, because Yahweh knew something the people didn't. And we see him being intentional with their every step. Now, for me, that's a record scratch kind of moment. In fact, it's a moment that I think sets us up for a greater context for this upcoming deliverance that we know is ahead. So I'm going to just take a second and name a few things here that are important. It's important to see that God was with Israel, to understand that his presence wasn't just with them in big moments when they needed him to do the miracle, but his presence was preceding the miracle. And it's important that we note that it was personal. Yahweh, the God of the earth, is leading them, and he's with them. And he's leading them in a specific direction for their ultimate good. And all of this, for those of us who are catching the story, is giving us a snapshot of both God who was protecting them, but also the God who was calling them forward into something greater. But not without God's active presence with them. In verse 21, we're told that Yahweh went ahead of them as a pillar of cloud to guide them on their way, and a fire by night to give them light so that they could travel either day or night. And this little snapshot, again, is emphasizing both Yahweh's presence with them, but also his intention in leading them. Pretty good so far, yeah? Are you tracking? Is the soundtrack playing in your mind from Prince of Egypt? Yeah, there was already melodies from the front row here of Whitney and Mariah, and we give thanks to God. All right, we're going to look over at chapter 14, so if you're following along with us, chapter 14, we're going to look at verse 4 here. Now, in chapter 14, something really interesting begins to happen. The Israelites make a bit of a pivot at Yahweh's instruction, and they camp out by this famous sea. Yahweh lets Moses, the leader of the people, in on something that's taking place in real time right at this moment. And he says, really, look, Pharaoh's beginning to question his decision, and he decides to go after the people he just let go. Do you remember that part? Chariots and the whole thing. I don't know if that's a chariot, but it feels like potentially, yeah. Now, Yahweh basically says to Moses, don't panic, but that he's actually going to use the enemy's pursuit to bring him glory. So Pharaoh begins his hunt, and the Israelite people catch wind of it. In fact, they can actually see the army coming after them. Such a comforting feeling. And man, they freak out. Those Israelites, no problem freaking out. I have such a connection with them. I honestly, anyone else is like, totally. And they start saying things like, why did you lead us here to die? Which they'll say again. Or we would have rather died in Egypt. Things that sound like things that people would say if they felt like certain death was behind them and in front of them. So this is the climactic moment. The people could only see the enemy behind them and a sea in front of them. Are you with me? There was no way out, no salvation in sight. And Moses then tells them to not be afraid, but to stand firm. And he tells them that they will see deliverance this day. Deliverance. How? Literally. I mean, let's just put ourselves in the story. If I'm standing there and there is an enemy behind me and a sea that I know is at least almost 2 miles deep, no thanks, and I'm standing in the middle, how? Where does deliverance come from? That's the question you should be asking. It's definitely the question I'm asking. And the good news is the answer comes rather quickly. Moses almost instantaneously in the text says, the Lord will fight for you. The word fight in the Hebrew is exactly what you'd think. It's to make war or to engage in battle. And so Yahweh begins to do this. And he begins to fight so that they can experience this thing called deliverance. Another way to read the word deliverance in the Hebrew is salvation. God was going to save them, and not just from something, but for something. Now, these words, the Lord will fight for you, it's on a lot of Instagram posts. In fact, I saw 3 yesterday, and they're right. But in this context, at least as we're reading it in the story, is really important. Because if you'll remember at the beginning of chapter 13, if you've read this story at all, the Israelites actually start their journey out of Egypt, and it says that they were ready for battle. The beautiful irony is that they were never going to have to fight. It's easy to feel like you have to defend yourself when you have felt like you have been fighting every moment of your life, which was also part of their deliverance. Now, in verse 15 of chapter 14, Yahweh wastes no time, and he declares that he will fight for the people, but at the very same time, he tells them to move on. This is very aggressive language. It sounds, I can hear my mother in it. You know, like, my mom's not the kind of woman who's like, all right, baby, just like take a few steps. No, she'd be like, move, we're moving. You know, she's kind of wonderfully aggressive, and I respect it and was scared of it. Still am, actually. That's still there. But Yahweh says, move on. In other words, move forward into the water. It's like he's saying, I've got this, now go. Walk forward into what feels like the impossible and trust that my fighting behind you is always connected to the path in front of you. Moses then lifts up his arms in that famous, quite climactic moment, and the people move. And as they move, a path is set before them. And you saw Prince of Egypt, at least some of you. Can you imagine the path for over 1 million people? Hefty. And hard to imagine, hard to conceive, and yet there was enough space for them to begin to move. This was a miracle of grand proportions. But that wasn't just it. The people begin to cross over, and it's in that moment that we read in the text that Yahweh now turns his presence to the enemy. So he's made the path, and he turns all that he is towards the enemy, and we see that Yahweh begins to fight for the people, and he's not doing this in like some kind of like breath of God kind of way. He is big and in charge, and he begins to jam the wheels of the chariots. We read that, like, what? So cool and cheeky of him. And he starts bringing confusion. Like he could have done anything. Like, nope. And yet he's like, let's just make them feel this for a second. I'm kidding, Anyway, I don't know what he was doing, but he jams the wheels. He creates this confusion. The chariots start freaking out. The animals start freaking out. And then we see from the text, even in this moment, that the army knew that Yahweh was coming to fight against them. A moment where they knew that this was true. And Moses, at Yahweh's instruction, then lowers his arms, and we read that the waters swallow up the enemy, completely annihilating this enemy that stood behind them right before their eyes. So here's the people of Israel walking on dry land through an impossible situation, and when they turn around, their enemy is nowhere in sight. Israel was not only delivered in their greatest moment of impossibility, but Yahweh once again showed them that he is a God who was not only protecting them, but was leading them to places they could not go on their own. And that's the story. Pretty good, yeah? Now, we've got this story in front of us, and we have to hold it in our hearts and imaginations today, but I'm going to draw our attention now just to a few things that I think really matter. You'll remember that in this series, we've been talking about a cadence or a melody found in the book of Exodus, and how it's actually a melody that's mirrored all throughout the scriptures, and it goes like this: creation, enslavement, liberation, renewal. Do you remember that? When Tyler said it, it kind of stuck with me. Do you want to sing it with me? Yes? Okay, so great. Creation, enslavement, liberation, renewal. I'm going to regret that hip movement, but I'm thankful we all did that together. Now, this is important because in Exodus, if we were to listen to the melody of this story, we would be in the wildly significant and catalytic hum of enslavement to liberation. Enslavement to liberty or freedom, that is something that if you're in Jesus, living at least in the West, you've probably understood at a soul level. But for the Israelite people, this was more than just a soul or spiritual experience. It was a physical reality. It was their entire reality for over 400 years. Bound to work in Egypt, to sit under a ruler who was oppressive with scarce resources and thinning hope, enslavement for the people of Israel was in their bones. It was worn on the blisters in their hands and on their blood-stained shirts. And so in this moment in our story, in this moment that so many have just captured as the great deliverance, we have to, if we're really going to understand what's happening here, stop and recognize what's taking place. And how Yahweh is in this great act of liberty, calling for their eyes and our eyes to see what it really means. What is deliverance about? And what is it for? And how do what we see him doing, how does that actually allow us to understand deliverance to be more than just a rescue, but it seems like a reorientation of a heart and of a life altogether? So I'm going to take a minute or two, and we're going to talk about some of the significant shifts we see in our text, and how each of these shifts begin to tell the story about what Yahweh is doing and who Yahweh is. So if you're taking notes, this is our first movement, significant shifts. Now, there are 4 that I want to name from the narrative, both at a theological and practical level. This is what stands out as significant to me. The first movement is that we see Israel move from having an oppressor to having a shepherd. So remember that when our story opened, we find Israel as people who are actually enslaved in Egypt. And they're enslaved under a Pharaoh who was undoubtedly cruel. Like when we start Exodus 1, we've got a bad guy. We've got a villain. And the story progresses, and then we find that we have another Pharaoh ruling too, and he was equally as cruel and stubborn, if not more than the one before him. Israel, for 400 years, knew nothing but a ruler that was not after their good, nor after seeing them flourish in the land, but one who was actually threatened by them to the point of harm to them and to many innocent children. This part of the text that we are finding ourselves in, this moment this morning that we get to live in, is the beginning of a shift. Moses had already come onto the scene, yes, but what we see in him after Passover is now a leader turned shepherd. We see him move from declarations to invitations. We see in him a reflection of Yahweh's heart Yes, he would literally lead them to greener pastures, but he would also lead them and be a shepherd to them, one who cares for them and guides them and demonstrates his love for them. And that to you might just seem like an insignificant shift within the main context of the story, and I get that. But I think this is really important to note because in it we find not only a shift of relationship of Yahweh to the people through Moses, but a shift in how the people now get to see themselves. Because now they're no longer objects to use, but they are stories to be told. Families to be shaped, and people destined to know safety and love and the gift of a new future. How we are loved. And what we see in Yahweh here is, as many of us know, the baseline for kingdom life. We don't live with an oppressor. We live with a shepherd. We don't live under a dictator, as the enemy would tell us, but we actually live under a father who has done everything he could do to love his children. The difference between being a loved individual and a neglected and used individual is worlds apart. Because we know, all of us humans know, that how we love and how we are loved shapes our lives unlike anything else in this world. And a shepherd loves, an oppressor neglects. And love, as all of us know, opens the door to 1,000 new realities and 1,000 new outcomes. This is the way of faith. This is the way of the kingdom. Love changes every story. Now, this shift, this imagery we see here is telling us a story about the people and about ourselves. You see, what's being told here is that love will now lead the people of Israel, not oppression. And the neglect of who they were will not have the final word in their life. Yahweh, as a shepherd, would be present to them before the miracles even came. It wasn't enough for Yahweh to stand far off, but to come close so that they would understand that love is the on-ramp to understanding and experiencing true deliverance. This was his moment to say, this is who I am. And what we know is that this is who he's always been. Now, next we find another shift. We see our story starts, at least hopefully you'll remember that it starts with a burning bush. Do you remember that? Okay. Well, in our text today, we see that fire, that same fire is mentioned, that presence of God now actually becomes visible to all. So we see a fire for one become a fire for all. I'm so bad at kitschy language, so just roll with that. Put that in your notes and make it better. Now, maybe this one feels like a stretch to you too, but if you know anything about ancient literature, it's important to note the imagery that the story is telling. In the burning bush, we know that God's presence was known through fire. That Moses had a life-changing experience and encounter with Yahweh at the burning bush. And now, as we read on in the story, we see that fire again, and it shows us a significant reminder of God's withness, of God's presence with his people, reiterating even his shepherding nature. You have to imagine. I mean, has anyone? Prince of Egypt last night was such an awakening. But we were watching this cartoon fire blow up in the sky. And I was like, what would that have been like? You have heard the stories. Moses said there was this burning bush, like, yikes, whatever. Did he sip the wrong water? I don't know, what was going on with the man, but he seems like he's got conviction, so we'll follow. But fire appears now in the sky and is always with you. Always with you. You have to think that the people were like, maybe that's the same. Maybe this is how he comes to us. Yahweh was like, I'm present. And at first he was present to one, but now he becomes both present and visible to all. Israel would never have to wonder if he was with them because he deliberately makes himself known. And this was for them. This was their way to not only trust, but believe that he would take care of them and that he would not take his eyes off of them. And because they were with him, then when he said, do not be afraid, they could look to the fire and go, I don't have to be afraid. Whatever lies in front of me and whatever's threatening behind me, I can look to the presence of God and my reality begins to change. This shift, this gift of his fire present with them was one of both mercy and compassion. Because Yahweh knows the fragility of the human heart. And so he, like a good father, comes near to them. Third, we also see water as a significant part of our story, primarily as it's seen here as an obstacle, which you know. But the shift is that that obstacle, just like it was when Moses was first sent out into the Nile, do you remember that? As an obstacle, was actually the vehicle for God's deliverance. It was a baptism of sorts. Water, historically in biblical literature, represents the power to purify, to provide deliverance, and also the power to destroy evil. Water is used all throughout the scriptures to tell the story about God's nature, of his character, of his ability to have dominion over what would seem like the wildness of the enemy. And in our story, the same is true. Water is always symbolic of something generative, something life-giving. And so the shift we see, honestly, one of the greatest shifts we see in our story today is that water, while for Israel represented certain death and impossibility, now presents the opportunity for life. A life that was better than they had ever known. But it took a minute. Remember, they were trapped. It's fair. The enemy was behind them, and the sea, a solid, immovable body of water, was before them. Water to them did not represent purification, but impossibility. But water, as Yahweh demonstrated by ruling over it, became the threshold for their deliverance. The impossible vision of the sea in front of them, the only way forward for them, even though it was blocked, actually became the miraculous threshold for God to do his most miraculous work yet. What was impossible to them via the water was actually the obstacle God used to reveal how much bigger he was than the impossibility. Their obstacles were his threshing floor, to both destroy the enemy behind him, but also to provide the miracles in front of them. Water, the Red Sea, or the Sea of Reeds, was their baptism into the miracle that only Yahweh could do. The Red Sea was their invitation to trust God in the impossible and to allow their souls to be delivered, to actually know spiritual freedom before their bodies knew spiritual liberation. Now, finally, we see a shift in our story from compliance to participation. This is a long shot. Anybody seen Flight of the Navigator? Yikes. I knew there'd be like 3 of us in the room. But remember when it's not Max, but the alien says, compliance. Okay? Some of us, maybe. Anyway, really classic film. My sister loves the movie. Anyway, compliance is a bad word. That was the whole purpose. I thought I'd give us all a moment here. Anyway, compliance, not the right word, but it's the best I've got today, and it makes me think of Flight of the Navigator, which nobody has seen. Now, the shift from compliance within the people of Israel to participation is actually what Yahweh has always done. Yahweh, from Genesis to this movement, has been a God in the mix kind of God. A God who comes near in the cool of the day, and a God who longs to know and be known, to join with his creation to bring about the realities of the kingdom. This is who he is. So this shift in our story is not a surprising one, but one that we do need to name. The people of Israel had lived under an oppressive force. And their whole life, they were driven to be compliant, yielded and yoked to the oppressor's wishes and desires at all costs, because doing this meant their survival. Deliverance, then, would be Yahweh saying, I've actually seen enough. It would not only be him fighting for their freedom, but it would also be him fighting for their dignity as well. At a very crucial part in our story, Yahweh tells the people to not be afraid and that he would fight for them. The opposite, by the way, of what an oppressor would say. And then, and we can't miss this, he doesn't just sit back and relax. In the next breath, he says, go. So like in so many ways, he's saying, take me at my word, and it will be through your obedience to the point of action, stepping in the water, that I will show you who I am and what I can do. They were not forced to comply. They were invited to participate. And participation with God is something that always demands faith and trust. It's always something that catalyzes the dignity of the individual stepping forward. Faith does not humiliate us. Faith does not put us to shame. Faith is not some inconvenience that we're trying to muster the strength to do. It is dependence on a faithful, righteous, true God. Participation and the faith that's connected to it calls us forward. And Yahweh, unlike the enemy and unlike the oppressor, is always finding ways to remind us of who we are in light of who he is. That's the invitation of participation. And Israel, in this big Disney moment, is like, this is who you are. But unless you participate, unless you move from compliance to participation, you actually won't know. You won't know the reality of who you are because you can't get the full picture of who I am. And without that, we can't see who we are. You with me? Yeah, great. Now look, these shifts, while easily observed, I know I'm not any Bible scholar here, carry with them a lot of meaning for us. And they're really important, and I'm going to get to that in just a minute. But we do first have to stop and lean into a more uncomfortable part of this story because we're trying to get the full breadth of what God's doing here. We've talked a lot about what Yahweh has done, but I think what is equally important for us to get, and really what we're meant to capture in this story, is also connected to Israel's response to Yahweh. And that leads us to the second movement today, looking back. Now, these shifts we just observed in our text, while very significant, also reveal to us the nature of the human soul. And that's what we call in the biz, the rub. Israel, in our story, while at least through our lens, is being totally and wildly rescued. We can hear the crescendo in the music as their journey continues. And yet it seems that they are still a little grumpy and ungrateful, at least maybe in how I'm reading it. And I've said this before in teachings, but it is just so easy for me to judge these silly and ridiculous people in scriptures. I'm always like, you're being so dumb, you know? And then I realize, like, I'm so dumb sometimes too. And then that's the point. Israel, in our story, instead of jumping to faith and excitement, almost immediately goes to fear. And in each of us, very much in myself, there is a tendency to do and respond how Israel did, even in the midst of a great deliverance. As a review, shifts were happening, major shifts were happening in and around them. Oppressors were being defeated, liberty was on its way, fire from heaven, God's presence was with them in a way they had never known it. The waters before them actually became a conduit of their actual deliverance. And their participation meant that they wouldn't just know the power of Yahweh, but they would know his wild love for them. These are the shifts happening all around them. They have a leader who loves them, God who is with them. And even with all these things before them happening all around them, we see fear rising, their sight being skewed, and enslavement calling. We see them looking back. In chapter 14, with the enemy visible, and they are, and yet the presence of God in their camp, we see Israel begin to not just wonder, but declare that life would have been better if they had never been delivered. You see, deliverance at the moment began to represent a lack of control, a lack of ability to name what the future held, an inability to know what comes next, or how to feel safe within that. And that is and can be a terrifying thing, right? Like, we know that. It's scary to think that the old familiar chains can often sound more melodic and safe than the new clanging sounds of deliverance. That's because the old ways are ways we know. And this is a new thing in a new place, and it's just so terrifying. Because in that tension, I realize that the impossibility before me will demand a movement from who I have been to who I was made to be. Deliverance in that very real human scenario would mean that holy imaginations, maybe for the first time ever, had to be engaged. And more than that, that faith actually had to exist for what could be. That trust would actually be the gateway to change, but trust would cost them the familiar and the safe and the anonymity of bondage. The anonymity of bondage. All they could think to do in that moment, God's fire from heaven, just army behind them, water in front of them, and all they could think to do was this. Looking back, we know this. It's the great distorter of present vision. Nostalgia, the great ideal or the safety of what was, that relationship, that person, that situation, that year, that era. All of it a rewritten illusion in our minds. And that was now stealing the great oxygen of faith that was in their camp. You see, the act of deliverance can either dilute our vision because we look back, or it can direct our vision towards something greater. Israel was not crazy for looking back, but they did have a choice in that moment. They could either allow the perspective that they gained to give them courage for what could be, or they could allow it to pull them back to what was. And that decision is at the heart of our third movement, promise over peace. The standout for me today in our text, and really the heart of this teaching, as I've spent time praying and seeking Jesus, it all lands here. It all lands here for us. This story, this famous one that we've all heard over and over again and we've known most of our lives, could today just be a delicate reminder to us that God is awesome and that he delivers people, and that's rad. I don't know who that is, but I just have to say to you, as I've sat with this and as God has met me, so painfully met me, I am certain that's not all there is. The image, and this is the best I got, man, it's garbage, but I'm trying to give you something. This image of the people with the enemy behind them and the sea before them is one I literally have not been able to shake from my mind, from my soul, because this image represents me. This image for me represents the contrast between a life of promise and a life of peace. You see, Israel felt the real threat of the enemy. And they weren't crazy to feel that way because the enemy had the ability, at some level, at least in human terms, to kill them. And they were standing between what was the familiar, even if it did come with shame and bondage and brokenness. And they were standing between what they knew and what they didn't know, and then all that could be. For them, in the faces of their enemies and the fate that would follow their capture and return, was peace. The peace that says you know what to expect and you know how to feel safe. The peace that says you're the same as you've always been and the same as you always will be, and so will the circumstances. The peace that says you know how to do this. You know how to live enslaved. You know how to ignore the nudging that you might just be something more than your enslavement and there might just be a better future in front of you. You know how to shut that down. The peace that requires no risk and ultimately no cost. The peace that says this is all there is. Peace. The peace that they would find behind them is a peace I know all too well. Now, the promise, that was something altogether different. The promise was in front of them, but the promise was impossible. In fact, everyone could see how impossible it was. So what were their real options? There was a sea in front of them, a sea that's over a mile deep with fish and other wildlife. Like, yikes, throw up, get me out of here. The sea that stood between them and some mysterious, imaginative place over here in the land of faith. It doesn't make sense on human terms, and the truth is they had never been this far from what they had known before. Promise was supposed to be a land of abundance and goodness, but I imagine that it seemed like someone else's reality, not theirs. Promise, at least as they could reason it in their minds, meant true deliverance, but it would definitely come at a cost. Peace and promise, that is the tension most of us walk in our lives with Jesus. And like the disciples, we're often presented in finding ourselves in places just like Israel in that weird photo. I mean, maybe we don't say that. I don't say it very often, but the truth is God is always wanting to save us from something for something. That is the active work of his sanctification, his rescuing of us over and over and over again. Paul says, you are saved, you have been saved, and you are being saved. This is the work that Jesus does by his Spirit. He's saving us from something, for something. That's the key part, for something. And if that's true, then we know from our text today that he wants to reveal himself to us not just as a deliverer from something, but a defender of all that the enemy has done, will do, and wants to do. All that the enemy has said to us, all that the enemy has declared over us and our futures, he wants to come as defender. The righteous one who can take up arms, and instead of you trying to fight the battle, he wants to be the one like fire in front of you saying, I'll fight for you. I am both deliverer and defender. They're not mutually exclusive. They exist together. And if you're going to be delivered, you are going to be delivered into something greater. And that means loosing the bonds of the oppressor. That means coming out of your shame. That means coming out of the shackles and living into a new reality. And here's the great news that I've been dying to tell you because I think it's great. All of this started with a cry. And I love that. I love a good cry. Because it's all we have. A cry is my best offering to God. Help is my best offering to God. It means I've relinquished the control and said, I can't do this myself. And all he needed was a cry. In Exodus 2, we read that the Lord heard the cry of the people and he had seen enough. And this is who Yahweh is in the scriptures. He steps in, he hears the cry of his people, and then he says, I'll do the impossible. Not just so that you're delivered, but so that you know who you are and who I am and what we're doing, that there's more than this. Yahweh, throughout their story, this is just, I know I'm like a Bible nerd, but this is like wild. He's making all these deposits like, I'm totally in this. Even the plagues, so freaky. Like, even watching yesterday, I was like, yikes, no. Those things, all of these things were representations of him saying, I'm fighting for you. I'm with you. I'm sending this Moses dude in the most impossible situation, should have died 10 million times, and still he comes forward as a leader and says, I will represent him to you. Yahweh comes in, he enters into the stories, every story, so that he could call us out of looking at our circumstances to looking to him as the deliverer. Now, over the last few weeks, just a full confession because we're doing that. I have really been wrestling, can you tell? And I'm out of breath, so I need to hit Pilates a little bit more this week. But I've been wrestling so much with this, like drowning in it. And this was long before I actually thought about my text, like no offense, but I was in Europe having a great time. And I wasn't even thinking like Red Sea, cool. Like I just wasn't here. So when I came to the Red Sea, I was like, oh crap. Right? I mean, that's what, anyway, preachers do, I do. And got back from Europe and I had realized that the Lord had already started speaking to me in Europe, a little unraveling, which is always so delicate and fun. But he just said to me, look, you have believed a lesser life for a long time. And it was like every night we were in Europe and my best friend, Heidi and I would just debrief the day. And every night it was like I could hear the chains of the enemy. And we had this thing when we were over there, we were like stomp on the serpent's head because I like aggression. And I hate him, and I've told you that, and you should hate him. But that was our mantra because the chains kept shaking at us about all kinds of things that are true of my past and my enslavement. Stuff that was done to me, stuff that I participated in, things that just are no longer true. And yet I keep looking back going, I think it's easier just to stay there. And he's like, but I've got more. And I'm like, yeah, sure. That is impossible, sweets. I mean, I respect what you're doing, and I appreciate this is a sweet nod. But you do that for other people. I see it all the time, but not me. So here's the deal. I had to actually figure out what promise meant. And what promise was going to cost me. You know, promise meant faith over fantasy, which was a shift that had to take place in me. It meant falling forward and not knowing where I'd land. It meant loving him more with my whole life than I had. And it meant I would have to fight and move forward. It meant that my position would have to turn from this to this. Someone said to me this week, set your face like flint. And it meant that that had to happen in order for me to step forward into the promise. And this is what I want to say to you today in the next 3 minutes. I felt very strongly that my invitation, or our invitation, it was mine, and then now it's yours. Sorry, transference, that's how that works. I've just had a really strong sense that this story, this child book at some level, totally scary story, was for us. And I don't often do this, but I had a really strong sense that the Lord said to me, are you not a mother in this house? Then mother. Because I've had intrepidation to say just these 2 things that I want to say to you. The first is this. I think because it's happening to me, and it's the best radar I've got, but I think that there are some of you in this room that you know you're in between. That you know that you've been looking back, even subtly, just maybe it's a new thing you're stepping into, or you know through what the Spirit's been doing among us that God's calling you to be all in, full faith. And you've tried, and I do it all the time too. I'm like, I'm all in, and then I'm like, oh no. My eyes like, anyway, that's cute. What a cute hat, or whatever. Or the enemy is behind me, and all I can do is just freeze. Because I can't move forward and I can't move backwards or I'll die. And I don't know what that means, except that my sense is that some of you are stuck. And the invitation for you today is to set your face like flint, to trust the Lord and to step in the water and move on with me. The other thing I want to say, with whatever authority God has given me, is that I think that's true for all of us. Communally, I think there's a story God's writing in our community that's profound. Like, I'm awake at night thinking, what's happening? It's so weird. And maybe you're visiting here like, yikes. You're going to have brunch after this. It's fine. We're almost done. But I just want to say to you, as someone who loves you, burns for you, prays for you, I think there's more for us. And as a mother, in all the ways that I can be, I think some of us need to get brave and do the hard thing and go together and see what God will have for us on the other side.